Time flies. Just last week, we read about Samuel, who was 12 years old and under the tutelage of Eli. This morning, we read from the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, and Samuel is now an old man. He has been a leader of his people in two different forms. One, he has been a political military leader in the style of the Old Testament judges, those who were powerful warlords who people surrounded and who protected people and kept the people safe for a time. He's also been a priestly leader, leading people in worship and in overseeing the sacrifices. You'll remember from last week that Eli, who taught him, had sons who wound up being terribly corrupt. And sadly, Samuel doesn't fare much better. His sons, whom he's given reign over these territories, have also proven to be corrupt, but in different ways, taking bribes from people and not properly observing God's laws. So the people are fed up. They are tired of all of this. And they go to Samuel and they say, "Give us a king." Other countries have kings, strong rulers who protect the people and provide for them so that their work and their labor can be something they can enjoy the fruits of. We want a king instead of you. And on the surface, this is something that seems very reasonable. If they've had these corrupt rulers, it makes sense that they would want something else in place where they would have more of a fair deal. But Samuel interprets this as something that is criticizing him personally. What's been going on up until this point is something that to us seems odd. It's what theologians refer to as a theodicy, a society in which God rules. And it's the responsibility of earthly rulers just to make sure that God's laws and God's rules are carried out among the people. So by wanting a king, and the key phrase here is the way other countries have it, it looks like they're not only turning their back on the leadership of Samuel's sons, but on God himself. Samuel prays to God about this, and God says something very chilling to Samuel. He says, "Do not be saddened because they're not rejecting you. They are rejecting me." The historian that gives us 1 Samuel sees this not just as something that speaks to the moment, but that goes way back to the time of the wilderness. You will remember that once the Hebrews are liberated from slavery, no sooner do they cross the Red Sea and are safely on the other shore before they begin grumbling and complaining. They complain that they have no food, that they have no water. Then they complain that they are tired of the type of cuisine that God has provided. And then they complain that they are wandering in this wilderness where it is hard for them to survive. God always provides for them, but no sooner do they have what God has given than they turn around and complain again. The writer of 1 Samuel sees this not as a rejection of Samuel, but a rejection of the covenant that God made with the people at Sinai, where the law was given to Moses and then the people. They are rejecting me and my ways. They're rejecting what God has to offer and turning their back on that promise. It's something that reminds us of that adage that God punishes us by answering our prayers. That's the kind of thing that we say when we've learned lessons the hard way, when we've had sage advice from other people and ample warning, but we go ahead and stubbornly do what we insist on doing anyway, and we suffer hard knocks as a result of it. Samuel lets them know that God will give them what they want. God will give them a king, but it'll come at a very steep price. Those of you who read the passage in advance notice the way the monarchy is described, and it's not something that any of us would aspire to. All right, go ahead and have a king. But you know what? He'll take your sons. Some of them will be his laborers, and others will be his soldiers. And he'll take your daughters too. They will be his domestic servants. And he will take the best choice of your livestock and your crops and your choice land and leave you with very little in place. If you want a king, that's what you're in for. And the people respond to Samuel, yes, that is exactly what we want. That's something that all of us can relate to who have ever had to learn about things by hard knocks. Whether we're talking about ourselves as individuals or in some cases communities of faith. Those times in a church when we get fixated on something that in retrospect was very, very trivial, but we realize all the time and the energy that we put into that over the course of a year or longer, fussing about something when we could have been doing other things, exploring the possibilities that God had in store for us. This interpretation that 1 Samuel gives is something that goes beyond what's happening in the moment. And it gets to the essence of who we are as spiritual beings, capable of having a relationship with God, of feeling God's presence within us, and being guided by God's presence, so that we discover who we were truly meant to be, the kind of witness we were intended to have, and the kind of church we were intended to be. So we rob ourselves of being as fruitful and productive as we could be if we just obeyed God rather than looking to ourselves. C.S. Lewis very imaginatively looked at this in his book, The Great Divorce. In this extended parable, it begins when a bus goes to hell, and it loads it up with citizens from hell and takes it to heaven. And you find out that in hell, people don't tend to have neighbors because they don't trust one another. So when a new resident arrives in hell, they go out and they build a home as far away from the other people as they possibly can, so they don't have to be close to other people. There's a story of some people who arrive in hell, and out of curiosity, they decide they want to look for Napoleon. And it takes them 40 years of wandering to finally find where his residence is because it's so far removed from everyone else. And they are looking in outside of his window, and he's just pacing around frantically and blaming everybody else for his problems. The generals who served under him, who were incompetent, the generals in other nations who had it in for him, the wife that he married, the mistress that he had, everybody else but himself. People in hell are mistrusting of one another, and they blame other people for their problems rather than taking responsibility for themselves. There's another characteristic that people in hell have, but that becomes more evident once the people of hell are let out in heaven. The bus lets the residents of hell out, and they wander around, and they find that they have trouble interacting with the terrain there in heaven. It's a beautiful paradise, just like the one that was promised, but they're not able to interact with the area the way you might think. Someone goes to walk on the grass and discovers that the grass are like razor blades, that the person's feet cannot slip into the grass, but instead the person remains on top. Someone else decides that he will try to cool himself by going into a river of fresh water that's there that looks very inviting. But he's not able to submerge himself beneath the river, and instead falls down on the surface and is swept away. Another person goes before a beautiful and a scrumptious looking tree and decides that he wants to have a piece of fruit. And there's an apple that's there on the ground, but he goes to pick it up and finds out it's as heavy as a boulder. But he insists that if he can just take this back to hell with him, he can plant it there and grow a tree like that. And the person is trying to pick up this boulder-like apple and carrying it under great strain, while an angel is warning that person, that is from this realm. You will never be able to interact with it or take it back to where you came from. The narrator is somebody who sits with someone who is a wise sage sitting cross-legged, advising him on the way of life. And this person informs him that he must recognize how completely inadequate he is to save himself from his sins. There is nothing he can do, there is no task he can accomplish that can allow him to escape the hell where he is a resident. And when the narrator realizes this and acknowledges that this is wise advice, and he too needs to reach out to God in order to be transformed, then he finds that he is transformed. He can now live as a citizen of heaven. He can walk along the grass. He can dip his hands in the cool water. He can enjoy the scrumptious fruit. All along, what was keeping him and others back is that they were trying to save themselves. It's only by emptying themselves and surrendering completely to God that they fully become citizens of heaven. And then at the end of that book, you were told that this is a dream, an allegory in which the narrator looked back and saw a reflection of his own life, but saw a reflection through the lens of heaven, where the world in which we live, where things are more clouded, are much more clear. A world of realizing that we only save ourselves by completely surrendering to God. Ultimately, that is the sin of the people of 1 Samuel. They want to be like other people. They want to look to other nations. They want to depend on their own might and their own cunning. And what God is saying to Samuel is, they are not turning their back on you. They're turning their back on me. They can be my people. They can be ruled by me. They can be great and prosperous, but they would rather live and look to themselves. You and I have choices to make. We've made lots of decisions, some the hard way and some the easy way. But what brings us all here this morning is that gentle pull of grace, that sense that there is something in this world beyond what we can see and experience with our five senses. That it is that which is much greater with us than us, in which we find out who we were truly meant to be. When we surrender and we empty ourselves to God, that is when we discover our true place in this world, and that's also where we discover our greatest joy.